It seems that there is really a lot of interest across the student body on our very special cross-party question time style debate today on the role of the West in Syria and other international crisis zones. We actually were discussing this earlier on Leeds Student Radio, which very kindly hosted a programme Political Animal on Syria today. So if you want to catch that, I believe the podcast is out soon. My name is Christine Gilmore, and I'm a second year PhD student and current head of a new Leeds University group called Leeds Friends of Syria, which exists to raise awareness amongst the Leeds public, particularly in the university, of the conflict in Syria and its humanitarian implications. And we are happy to host this debate tonight. With us on the panel, in order from the left, is David Lucy from Leeds University Socialist Workers Student Society. Next to him is Hannah Dudley of Leeds University Amnesty International, followed by Ayhan Hamdi, who is representing Leeds Friends of Syria, and he is a Syrian from Aleppo. Next along is, I believe, Natalie Oliver.
Alex is in between.
Sorry, Alice, didn't see you. Sorry, Alice Smart, running to be education rep, I believe, the union, so you've probably seen her face on all of those posters. Needs no introduction really, but is representing Leeds Labour students, followed by Natalie Oliver of Leeds Liberty League, and next along is Lance Casely Hayford, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, of Leeds Liberal Youth. Yeah. And last but very much not least is the inimitable Sequoia de Souza. Now help me here. Vinya's-Warren? More or less. Okay, that's good.
Phonetically pronounced if you say it slowly.
Thank you. Sequoia is a kind of independent voice on this panel, I suppose. Following question time ethics, we've decided to get somebody who's not affiliated to any sort of political or campaigning group, but nonetheless representing Leeds Engaged Speakers Forum, which is a kind of forum for critical thinking and controversial views, and we expect no less from Sequoia tonight. Quick note on the format of the debate. The speakers are first going to debate some questions provided by the chair, and then we're going to open the questions up to the floor. So please, get your thinking caps on, get some good questions ready, and you're welcome to try and wrong-foot the panelists as much as you like. Please, however, do bear in mind that they are not experts in international law, and with the exception of Ayhan, are not Syrians either. So, try and bear that in mind, and don't give them too much of a kind of killer question. Afterwards, I don't think we're particularly going to try and take up the whole amount of time here. We can all have a bit more of an informal chat. If any issues come up or you want to hear a bit more about our activities or the activities of any of the other groups represented, feel free to ask. Quick background on the issues. As you'll all know, we're approaching the 2nd anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, which will be on the 18th of March. And, at that time, on that day, some young boys graffitied on the walls of their school, "The people want the fall of the regime," and they were then picked up by the security forces. They were incarcerated. Their parents didn't know who they were, where they were. They were tortured. Some of them were killed. And in response, the people went out to the streets in Daraa, which is in southern Syria. The authorities fired on those protesters. Protests spread, largely peaceful at first. The government continued to crack down on the protesters. And, we've ended up in this kind of escalating situation whereby today, Syria is very much in a state of civil war. And this week, in fact, the United Nations and independent activists working on the ground in Syria have reported that up to 70,000 people have been killed in the last 2 years, with over 60,000 missing, presumed dead, and 200,000 in prisons. In addition to that, the UN has now documented more than 830,000 Syrian refugees who've been forced to flee their homes and the country, who are mostly in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, so the neighbouring states, and also a fair few in Egypt, which does not require visas for Syrians to enter. according to the UN's Human Rights Chief, Nabi Pillai, I hope I got that right, divisions within the UN Security Council, which resulted in, of course, the Chinese and Russian veto used on several occasions to prevent a no-fly zone being put in place or any kind of intervention occurring in Syria, continues to have disastrous consequences for the country. And she also said, again, just this week, that the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, should be indicted for war crimes charges at the International Criminal Court for his manifest failure of his obligation as a head of state to protect civilians in his country. She also commented, which is quite relevant for this debate today, that this charge against him could be the opening for international intervention of some kind, which I guess we will go on to debate today. This has to be balanced, however, against a situation whereby there appears to be very little appetite for Western intervention. Compared to the rhetoric last year of Obama, the EU, David Cameron, when they were basically saying Assad will be out in a few weeks, and there was kind of a push towards imposing a no-fly zone. In his State of the Union address this year, Barack Obama basically said that they are continuing to put pressure on the Syrian regime and support opposition leaders that respect the rights of every Syrian. So as you can see, very little of any kind of concrete proposals there for what to do about the situation. And I think it says a lot when Lakhdar Ibrahimi, who is the UN representative dealing with Syria and dealing with Bashar al-Assad, calls himself the man without a plan and has confessed to being completely pessimistic about the possibilities of a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Again this week, to give you an example of how far things have deteriorated in the country, 4 Scud missiles were actually fired on residential areas around Aleppo by the Syrian regime this week. And you can imagine a Scud missile as a weapon of mass destruction. It's not something that should be fired into an ordinary street and ordinary houses. And this kind of begs the question, of course, what is the red line on Syria for the international community? What does Bashar al-Assad have to do before some kind of intervention is contemplated? Chemical weapons have been raised as one red line. Are there any others? We'll go on and ask the panel. So I think I'll kick off with a couple of more general questions about intervention. And I'm not sure who would like to start. I would like to know, under what conditions, if any, do you believe that intervention in the affairs of a sovereign state are justified? And perhaps I could ask David Lucy to start that off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in terms of a nation state, particularly like a Western nation state, that's very powerful in terms of the international community intervening in others, I don't think that is ever justified, really, because I think the idea that it comes from a humanitarian state of mind is fundamentally flawed. I think that the Western powers and the international community all have their own objectives whenever they intervene anywhere. I mean, you can see this in the discrepancy between talking about intervening in like Syria or Iraq and not intervening in others where very, very similar things happen. So in like the Rwandan genocide, there was no like Western intervention there. And the West does have very much has its objectives in Syria. After the Iraq war, they've actually found themselves in a much weaker position in the Middle East. Iraq has moved much closer to Iran, and Egypt is much more belligerent towards Israel than it was. So this sort of conflict in Syria is seen by them as a way that they can re-establish themselves in the Middle East. And this is also true of the regional players. So the Turks have an interest in getting into Syria to try and attack the Kurdish, because the Kurdish, the Kurdistan Workers' Party is continuing a conflict in the eastern part of Turkey, as well as this Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states also have interests in terms of preventing Syria. Syria's always been an opponent of theirs in the region, has always been very belligerent towards them, along with Iran. That forms the kind of, I've heard people refer to it as almost like a Cold War in the Middle East between Iran and Hezbollah and Syria and the other kind of from the Gulf states, which are more Western bound. I think that's the context we have to see it in that Western intervention is not for the people of Syria, it's not for the benefit of the people of Syria, it's very much in their own interest. If you look at historically what intervention has achieved for the people when it actually happens, it's always been cataclysmic for them. And you see this historically as well as contemporary. So, I mean, Iraq now, there are car bombings every few days where like tens of people die. There's almost a state of civil war there. Also, historically, if you look at colonialism, which essentially was justified in very similar terms, you had the mission civilis trice and the white man's burden, the idea that all these Arabs can't look after themselves, so we have to go and intervene and show them how to sort themselves out. And that's where the root of all these problems come from, these colonial exploitation of these countries, as well as the way that the nations were drawn up themselves. They're very insensitive to divisions between ethnicities in the areas, and a result of these conflicts is in fact colonialism. So I think that's the context to bear in mind, that in the long term this will be much worse for the people of the region.
All right, thank you very much. Perhaps I could just turn now to this smart Leeds Labour student for her party's or her own personal views. I'm not sure which, probably a combination of both on this issue.
I disagree with Dave in the sense that intervention is never justified. I think it can be justified. I think it's the primary responsibility of the president of the country or the government to protect their citizens, and that isn't what's happening in Syria. I think if a nation has the capability to go in and help those people, then that's what they should be doing. I don't know what the best way about doing this is, and I don't think we should think about intervening until we know what it is. I think Dave made some good examples about when an intervention hasn't worked. It isn't always effective, but I don't think we should rule it out. I think when so many people are dying day on day, I think we need to start thinking about what we can do about it.
Thank you very much, Alice. Could you pass over to Natalie just to get her views on this issue?
My views are actually very similar to Dave's on this. I agree with absolutely everything that he said. The point that he made about it's not necessarily in the best interest of the actual citizens is backed up completely by Iraq, where there was a recent survey where 65% of Iraqis actually rated their quality of life the same or worse than when Saddam Hussein was in power. And so there's obviously a huge discontent with other Middle Eastern countries with our intervention. And so it's not massively justified when we don't have the support of surrounding regions. There is very little support from, there's Qatar and Saudi Arabia that are supporting rebel forces at the moment in Syria. So there's not really much of a basis for us to go in. And with going into that country, who's to say which side we should be on? With Syria, it's such a secular nation, so the rebels, they don't have one united force. It's very different to Libya in that front. So there's no way that we could say we're going to back this rebel group, because then we're just sort of being imperialist again and imposing which decision or which government they're going to have next. They're not going to have democracy. So if we want to decide who's going to rule that country, then it's a little bit colonial again.
All right, well, thank you very much, Natalie. Could you pass over now to Lance to get the view of Leeds Liberal Youth on this issue? And if we could just try and stick for the moment to the kind of broader question of, under what conditions, if any, is intervention in the affairs of any sovereign state morally justified? And we'll kind of move towards looking at the Syrian issue and other topical issues in particular after a bit.
I would say it can be justified. I would agree with Alice on a lot of what she said, especially when it comes to Syria. Assad has the responsibility as the president to protect his people. He has more or less waived from that responsibility, and we can see that. We've all seen that on media outlets and so on and so forth. I think we can't, on the issue of intervention, we can't. I think it's too simplistic to say for or against. I think we need to actually take the situation as it is into account and not go down this whole for or against. Every situation is different. I mean, the other panelists have pointed out where intervention has not been ideal for the people of those states. And I would say, like I said, I think let's not. I would say the idea of for or against isn't ideal.
Okay, thank you very much. And just before we finish, I want to get Sequoia's views on this as the kind of independent voice of the panel, and then we'll move on to the Syrian issue in particular.
Okay, I'm not sure quite what implies to be an independent voice, but unfortunately, I feel like I'm probably going to echo the thrust of David's argument to the extent that before we even analyse the notion of humanitarian intervention, we should probably invert commas when I use that term, or its blood-soaked, morally corrupt cousin, if you like, Western intervention. We need to understand the foundational assumptions upon which their claims for benign motives are made. To the extent that, as they've rightly pointed out, there is usually an agenda or an objective. And if we're being really clear about this, I would go as far as to say, we, as the West, as a rule, do not care about human suffering. Now that might sound extreme. I'm not expressing my personal opinion or expressing the views of those people that live within the countries, but in terms of the elites and the government policies, that's borne out similarly again to what David said throughout the last 400 years of exploitation, rape, pillage throughout colonial history, but also contemporary examples. And even if you look beyond the current global status quo, which obviously those very same countries that cry these crocodile tears for human suffering are the same ones that are the main architects and beneficiaries of a global system that's based on exploitation and greed and frankly suffering. So it seems a bit outrageous, frankly preposterous, this whole notion of Western intervention.
All right, thank you, Sequoia. I mean, I think I'd quite like to move there. Lance's point about how it's hard to talk about these things in a kind of abstract sense, that you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And following on from that, I would ask the panel, is the Syrian revolution turning into a genocide? And if so, how does that affect the debate on whether international intervention is justified? I mean, would intervention in Syria under the pretext of the UN clause responsibility to protect, and which was used for intervention in Libya in 2011 for humanitarian reasons, so-called, be justified here, and would it be effective? And if I could go, first of all, to Ayhan Hamdi to get his views, please.
I think, yes, this is the main point in relation to Syria. As this is around now, it's reaching 7,000 people, and it's continuously happening. It's the main point. You cannot compare it to other places. If the intervention was a problem in other places, each country has its own problems. Like in the case of Iraq, why the intervention happened there? Was it happened as same in Syria because people were dying? No. It happened because you have a dictatorial regime with mass destruction weapons, and the West feared that they may use them improperly, and they used them against the Kurds. But in Syria, you have 7,000 deaths, and now they are using mass destruction weapons against their own people, against the civilians. I think you should put everything behind you, even if you are looking for the opposition that they are not united. It's true, they are not united, and they are not professionals, they are not the government. They are trying to defend themselves. You have to support them as people, as a human being.
Okay, and if I could just ask you, and elaborate, what kind of intervention do you think would be justified in Syria?
Syrians don't want troops on the ground. Syrians want help. We want humanitarian help on the borders for refugees. That didn't happen. Many of the people died inside Jordan, not inside Syria. They died because of the cold, because they are left alone. We had security in the Security Council. There was a gathering for supporting the refugees, or internally or externally displaced. And this was what happened on the 30th of August 2012, before the winter. And they didn't take any measure. Even, it's not only China and Russia, even the Hillary Clinton didn't attend that meeting. and they didn't do anything. Only until 30th of January, they had like donors meeting in Kuwait to support the refugees. And coming to the type of intervention that maybe Syrians need, it could be in different ways. Assad still is taking arms from Iran and Russia. Can the world don't stop them? This is a really main point. They are still selling their oil by Iran. Can't we do anything about it? They are firing missiles. Can't we use at least the Patriot missiles on the Turkish border to shut down these missiles? What is going on the civilians?
Thank you very much. If you could pass it now to Amnesty, just to see her view. Just to reiterate, the question originally was, is the Syrian revolution turning into a genocide, and if so, how does that affect the question of whether we should intervene or not?
Well, actually, I was just going to talk about the responsibility to protect first, which was the sort of second part of your question. I think the concept of humanitarian intervention is evolving into the doctrine of responsibility to protect. That's generally what we talk about. And under that doctrine, if a state isn't responsible, if it manifestly doesn't protect its citizens, then we have the right to disregard those sovereign principles and intervene, I think, to help citizens. Amnesty's view on, I've been reading up a bit about Amnesty's view on this situation, in particular in Syria, and actually they don't support armed Western intervention, but they do, under the responsibility to protect, it's encouraged you take other methods, so not necessarily military, that would be like the last resort, but you choose diplomatic and economic means first. And under this sort of guide, the Amnesty's organisation recommends that there's independent and impartial investigation of human rights crimes. They're really strong on the fact that it should be referred to the ICC, so that anyone considered to have committed crimes of war can actually be tried for it. And deployment of human rights monitors, which were there, I think last year, but haven't been sort of consistent presence due to difficulties because of what the regime has its limits on how much these monitors can go in and when they can go in. And also an asset freeze against Assad and others working with him. So I think at the moment, in terms of Amnesty's perspective, military intervention is not the best course of action. And actually other measures should be taken, and they're going to prioritise those over military action at the moment. But I think, in my personal opinion, the principles of a sovereign state have been breached, because there's been a fundamental lack to protect citizens actively causing them harm. I think that there is a moral case to definitely intervene in Syria.
All right, thank you. Perhaps you'd like to pass on to David Duty now and see if he thinks that the genocide, if there is one that's going on in Syria, affects the case for intervention.
In terms of whether there's a genocide going on, I mean, I don't know. There's definitely, I've read reports that says there's a potential for one in terms of kind of attacks on the Kurds or the Alawites, but I've also read other places that this is a kind of propaganda battle by the Assad regime itself, using its security organisations to try and cause this sort of this conflict between different groups. So I can't answer that. I think in terms of whether the fact that there's genocide going on, whether that should affect Western intervention or not, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is whether Western intervention prevents genocide. I mean, you look at the actions that Western powers have taken in places where they have intervened. In Iraq, David Petraeus started using a group called the Wolf Brigade, who were sectarian, I think they were Sunni sectarians, who went around torturing and killing the Shias. So, I mean, there's nothing to stop the West from using this to their own ends, using the sectarian conflict to get their own objectives. I mean, the same thing happened in Libya. We armed all the rebels, and then the different militias began attacking each other. So I think we still have this kind of idea that, like, the West is this sort of kind of glorious beacon of liberal democracy and freedom and equality for all. It's really not. They're definitely going to use these rifts between different groups for their own ends. So I think definitely we have to say that military intervention is absolutely terrible. In terms of sort of humanitarian aid, I think there's much more of a case there in what can be done. I think at the same time there's still issues with states doing that. So when William Hague said that they're going to give £5 million worth of mobile phones to the people of Syria, and like kind of communication technologies. These are like, they're sort of displayed as kind of neutral acts, but they're designed to be utilised in a kind of offensive capacity to try and support the militias that the West supports in Syria. I think what we can do then as people who aren't, as I say, I think Leeds Friends of Syria is a very good example of that. So if you provide money and your own supplies to help refugees in Syria, that's the best thing you can do, really. As well as, I think, also challenging the West and your own country, Britain. I think lots of these problems do stem back to Western intervention originally in the early 20th century, and the West will continue to do this unless it's stopped. So I think that the best thing we can do to have solidarity with the people of Syria is to stop the Western military machine. And we can do this by stopping arms dealing that has flooded the Middle East with weapons, and we're stopping our army going and intervening in countries and causing even more conflict than was already there.
All right, thank you very much. I think now I'm going to turn to Alice Smart of Leeds Labour Students on the basis that Tony Blair, of course, was one of the main architects of the liberal interventionist ideology and strongly defended it in the case of Yugoslavia, for example. So perhaps you'd like to give us your views on this.
Okay, well, we've talked about the UN clause for the responsibility to protect. I think the West absolutely have a responsibility to protect. I think the question is just how we do this. I think Dave's talked a little bit about humanitarian aid, and I think that's the most obvious way that sort of manifests itself of how we can help by intervening. I don't think that military intervention is the best course of action at the moment. I don't think it's obvious what the best course of action is. I think in a case like Libya, where it was a lot clearer that by enforcing the no-fly zone, that would help towards the people of Libya. I don't think there's as clear a strategy for what we can do to help the people of Syria. So I think at the moment we should focus on humanitarian support, and then if we are going to intervene, we should not rush into it. It should be once we found out what a good strategy would be and how it could actually benefit the people of Syria.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'd just like to get Ayhan's response.